Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. I am joined today by Cardinals fan extraordinaire and good friend of the show, Brendan Frazier. He is one of the leading thinkers in applied behavioral finance. He's a must follow. If you want to think about how to take the learnings of behavioral finance out of the ivory tower and apply them to your practice. Welcome to the show, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We had to cut ourselves off a second ago from talking about the Cardinals anymore because we actually had to record this podcast. But first thing I wanted to say is this. I also just wanted to give you a thanks, give you a shout out for all the work that you do as well and the influence that you've been on me, but also the industry as a whole. Like, you know, they call George Kinder the father of life planning, right? He's kind of like, whether he was self-titled or he just picked up that name, that's kind of the name you get. I think you're kind of the father of applied behavioral finance for financial advisors at this point. So he did not pay me to say that, everybody, don't worry. But I just think the work that you do is great and awesome and impactful. And I think, you know, I just want to give you a shout out and say thanks for everything that you do as well.
No, man, I appreciate it. We are here in the Mutual Admiration Society. We have a great conversation today about how to get these things applied into our everyday lives. And I think we've got to start at the very beginning, because there's been some fascinating research coming out in Natixis and Morningstar and other places. We know two things, and they're sort of paradoxical. We know on the one hand that the behavioral piece is the biggest value that advisors add to the lives of their clients. That's really not up for debate anymore. Like, it is what it is. There's a ton of data to support that. But then we also know that clients aren't asking for it, right? So Natixis found that 83% of financial professionals think that behavioral coaching is one of the most important things they do. 6% of clients, right? The Morningstar study that came out a little while ago, their question about, it was something around how much do you value behavioral coaching? It was the least important thing, according to investors. But the most important thing has a strong behavioral element to it. It was, my advisor helps me reach my goals, understands and helps me reach my goals. So how do we bridge this seeming paradox between these two worlds where the thing that we do that adds the most value is perceived as sort of useless by our clients?
Yeah. Okay. Man, we're starting off hot here, right? So
coming in hot.
I like this though, because I wrote a piece about this or on this a couple months ago that, when you create content, you never really know like what's going to be, you kind of have a feel, but you don't really know. And this is one of those ones that like took off, got a lot of feedback on. And so it tells me, I think that there's people out there that are also wondering this and asking that same question, right? Like we know that it's valuable. Nobody argues that it's not valuable. We now know, like you said, that it's probably one of the most valuable things that we can actually do. And nobody really argues, at least not very well, that that's not the case. Mm-hmm. But then, like you said, we have this dichotomy in these studies that show that clients don't really see it that way. There's also some statistics out there that the vast majority, 70, 80% of advisors don't even communicate that as the value proposition, whether in their marketing or in client conversations. And so, like you said, naturally the question becomes, how do we think through this? Should we be communicating it? Yes or no? If so, like, how do we do it and do it in a way that's actually effective if people don't want it? So I think it's first of all helpful to take a step back and think through this through the lens of, or zoom out and look at it from the perspective of another industry or another profession, and think of it as like a personal trainer type relationship. So when somebody goes to a personal trainer, right, when they go and they want a personal trainer, what they don't generally think to them. So let's start with what they do think. They think, hey, I need to lose 20 pounds. I need to eat healthier because I want to look good, feel good, and have energy to play with my kids. What they generally don't say is, hey, I need a personal trainer because I need somebody to help me get out of bed in the morning, not hit the snooze button on my alarm, and to help me push through doing the last couple reps that I need to do. But ask any personal trainer, hey, what is it that you really do? What's your real value to working with somebody? Is it the plan that you put, the eating plan, the eating regimen? Is it the workout regimen? And they'll say, no, it's just simply the fact that I get them to do the things that they don't want to do and to avoid the things that they know they shouldn't be doing. And so you think about that through the lens of working with a client. It's like, hey, you want to retire? Great. I can get you there in 5 years. Here's the plan and the investment portfolio to do it. But more importantly, by the way, I'm going to get you to do the things that you don't want to do and you should do, and avoid the things that you shouldn't do. Right? And that just doesn't resonate with people, but we know that it's true. So then I think we first need to kind of look at it through the lens of, okay. And actually, I'll borrow from what you said and our friend Joy Leary said, which is, I think, one of the best ways to think through this. That is, there's a big difference between what people want and what they need, and what we know people want and what they need. And this is the perfect example. And so in our conversation on my show, we talked about, you use the example of getting kids to eat their vegetables. And you've got to try to get creative and figure out ways to slip in the vegetables that they need. Or our friend Joy Leary, another great follow, by the way, she used the example of us putting spinach in a smoothie. So if you've never had a smoothie and put spinach in there before, it's pretty fascinating. You can stuff as much spinach as you want into the smoothie. And yeah, it might change the color, but it doesn't change the taste. So you can't taste the spinach, but you get all the benefits from it. And so I think we first need to think through it from that perspective and say, okay, we need to, these things are needed. The behavioral element and the behavioral coaching component is needed. And we can talk about ways to do that, but you've got to slip those components in so that they benefit from it, whether they know it or not. The second thing I think we need to do is say, okay, let's take a step back. If we're going to actually communicate this value or decide whether to communicate it, I think you have to first start by thinking through what's your purpose or what's your reason why you actually want to or feel the need to communicate that as being part of your value. And generally, when you're trying to convey your value to somebody, you're doing it either to get them to move to become a client or to justify the ongoing services you provide. You're doing it to say, hey, it's worth working with me, or it's worth the fees that you're paying me. Mm-hmm. And so if you think about it through that lens, you say, okay, am I doing this just simply to get somebody to see the benefit of working with me and the value of working with me? Am I doing this so that somebody can say, so my clients will say, hey, you're worth the fees that I'm paying you? What I would say to that is that that's not the most effective way to do it. Trying to tell somebody what they need when they don't want it, it's not an effective way to do that. What is effective is actually getting somebody or providing the results that they want. So people don't buy the plane ticket, they buy the destination. It's one of my favorite phrases that I've heard. And so if you're thinking, hey, I want to tell you that behavioral coaching is a value of mine because I want you to work with me, or I want you to pay me and it's worth it, that's probably not the best way to go about it. The best way to go about that is to give them the results that they want. Carl Richards says that clients don't care about your solution. The clients care about their problems and not your solutions. Mm-hmm. But I'll finish it with this. If you still think it's important and there's a reason and it's valuable and you want to convey that message to clients, you still want them to know that it's a piece of what you do, which I can get that too. There's two things you have to know. One's the framing, or one's the timing of it, and one's the framing. So are you familiar? Have you ever used a car that has lane control?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. So you do. Okay. All right. So you know how it is. It knows where you're at. If you start drifting outside the lane, it'll bring you back in. Right. Mm-hmm. All cars will get you from A to B. Doesn't matter where you are. If you get in the car, it'll get you from A to B, whether you have lane control or not. So looked at through that lens, lane control is not really that important. In fact, you'd probably say it's not necessary. I can get from A to B without lane control, but then it's not important until it is. It's not important until you're sitting there driving 80 miles an hour on the interstate, daydreaming about Roth conversion strategies and how you're going to implement them in your practice. And then you hear the vibration on the side of the road going 80 miles an hour, and it nudges you back into the lane. And in that moment, you go, oh, wait a minute. That was pretty valuable. That was necessary. So we need to think about this behavioral coaching thing, behavioral management, through that same lens, which is the timing of it's important. So it's the best time to convey that the value is when the value is on full display. So when the market actually had a guy on the podcast that gave me this example. I think it's a good one. He talked about how he had a client who had $1 million. The market dropped 40%, convinced her to stay invested. You know, your classic behavioral coaching example, mm-hmm. right? Convinced her to stay invested. The account goes back up to $1 million. And that right there is that when it's on full display, when you can point out, hey, the reason we got back here is because we stayed invested. And at that point, that's a $400,000 decision. They'll never be able to pay you enough money your fees will be covered for the rest of that client's life. Second thing is the framing. So in that Morningstar study that you mentioned, what most people don't know is that Morningstar actually went back and conducted a second study where I went and asked people to rank the value of a financial advisor. And instead of using the term helps me stay in control of my emotions, which ranked number 15 out of 15. And if you asked the people that did the research, it was like by far and away down at the very basement, number 15, but like the big gap between 15 and 14. They changed it from helps me stay in control of my emotions to helps me avoid panic selling during market downturns or something along those lines. Helps me avoid it basically helps me avoid panic selling during market downturns. And that bumped it up from number 15 to number 9. Right. And it's all because people don't think about needing somebody to help them stay in control of their emotions. They don't want that. What they do want, though, is to not sell their portfolio during the market downturn. So if you're gonna convey the value, frame it in a way that's more impactful, right? Don't say you help somebody can't stay in control of their emotions. Tell them exactly what it is that you do, and then make sure the timing's right when the value's on full display.
Yeah, I think that we in the behavioral finance world have done a lot of selling plane tickets or attempting to sell plane tickets. And I think we've perhaps not focused enough on the destination, right? I think that Morningstar study, both iterations of it are a beautiful example where you can use the destination. You know, the number one thing they wanted, of course, is that my advisor helps me reach my goals. If we frame what we're doing from a behavioral perspective, we know in terms of that thing that they care about, then we're not selling plane tickets. We're selling the Hawaiian beach, right? And I think that's a much more compelling thing.
Yeah. When you put it that way, I hadn't thought about this before, but on that Morningstar list of what clients want, the number one thing, like you said, is achieving financial goals, right? Mm-hmm. That is the destination, right? You know, everything else on that list is generally the plane ticket, like maximizes my investment returns, allocates my portfolio, helps me stay in control of my emotions. So that's a really good point. That illustrates right there what people really want and what you need to speak to what they want, give them what they want, but then slip in the things that they need.
So my first job out of grad school was doing pre-employment assessments of primarily banking talent. And so as part of this, I'd interview people for like half a day. I'd give them a battery of psychological assessments. And then I would create this report. And delivering that report was my favorite part of my whole job, because you would literally see people's jaws just drop when you said, this is who you are, this is what you're like. And they would just go, wow, like you got me, right? You got me. So I've become obsessed in my work at Orion. I want to recreate that. I want to help advisors recreate that with their clients in an initial meeting. I want to give them the tools and the training to sit down with that client. And when they're done, have that client go, wide mouth, like, oh my gosh, like you totally get me. And yet this is our goal, right? Should be our goal as an industry. And yet you say that many advisors actually create reverse rapport in that first meeting. What do you mean by that? And how are we getting it wrong?
Yeah. So, by the way, there's already some people that are out there going, wait a minute. And I know that because when I first kind of came across this concept and started like brainstorming it and thinking through it, it was a little bit uncomfortable for me too, because I started thinking like, no, that can't be true. So we're always told when we're meeting with somebody, when you're trying to make a connection, that you want to establish rapport. And so and it's because your brain says, hey, I really want this person to like me. I really want them to like me. And I want them to like me so that they'll trust me, so that they'll do business with me, so that they'll listen to me. Right? We know these things. So generally, when we think about establishing rapport, oftentimes you may have somebody come in or you go meet somebody and it's like, hey, did you watch that game this weekend? How about the weather? How was your drive in? If it's you and me, like, people can't see this obviously, but you've got those guitars back there, right? So it might be like, oh, hey, you play guitar? I play guitar too. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't come from a bad place, right? It makes sense that we want people to like us. You're trying to break the ice. But ultimately, if you're talking about how to get somebody from being a prospect to a client, or you're trying to talk or convince somebody to follow through on your advice, that's not what people want. People don't care how much you know about the second string quarterback on their football team. And so one thing I would say about that is if anybody listening can pull up their phone, they can go to the contact section of your address book, your contact section, And you can probably find 300 people, hundreds of people you can go through and you can make some type of connection with, where you've built some base level of quote unquote rapport. You've made a connection. You could probably talk to them about their favorite football team or the destination that they go to. But how many of those people do you do business with? How many of those people are actually clients? And the reality is that it's probably very, very few. And that's because that's simply not enough to get people to move from being a prospect to a client. What people really want to know, right, is that, like you said, they want to know what they want to feel understood. They want to feel heard, and they want to know that they can trust you. They want to know that you're the person that understands their problems, that you understand where they're at, that you understand what they're going through, but more importantly, that you give them the certainty that they need to get them to where they want to go. And so in your example, I'll use your example of creating these assessments to make people feel heard and understood. I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine that you probably don't have a list of questions that ask like, hey, what's your favorite type of food? What's your favorite sports team? What's your favorite guitar? Right? Like, these aren't bad questions, but they're kind of just glossing over. They're delaying getting to the actual point. I imagine that what you're trying to do is help advisors with these assessments that help the client use these assessments to better understand the client and the relevant information about their situation, and to make the client feel heard and understood, not about their personal life, but about their situation as a whole. Am I right? Is that?
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Okay. And it's for a reason, right? It's like, again, people, they want to know that they like you. Yes. But they need to know, can they trust you? And can you offer the certainty to get them the results? Like we said, the results again, that they want. And so if you think about, okay, all right, Brendan, that's great. Cool. Thanks for telling me that I don't need to ask about the weather, right? Thanks for telling me that I'm creating reverse rapport, but like, what do we actually do about it aside from using what you're working on, which would probably be a good way to start. What we know is from the research is two things, is that there's pretty much a shortcut to building likability and trust. And that's through asking questions and listening. So if you can ask somebody great questions about themselves, but not just about themselves, but about their situation. So instead of asking them, hey, how's the weather? Asking things like, hey, what prompted you to come in today? Or if they're coming in to talk about how their business is going to be a part of their retirement plans, get them talking not just about random things, but start asking about the business and the implications of the business and the challenges that they're facing and what brought them in to talk about the business. So you can still talk about things at a general level. You can still ask questions that create, again, the research shows the more questions you ask, the more trust gets created. You can ask the questions. You just have to ask the right questions, the relevant questions that answer what's on the client's mind, which is, can I trust this person? And do I feel certain that they're going to get me the results that I want? We also know that when people talk about themselves, that it lights up the same area of the brain as sexual activity and eating chocolate. And so the better relevant questions you can ask to get people to talk about themselves and reveal relevant information, the more they're going to say, this guy gets me. He understands this situation that I'm in. He's obviously done this before with other people. I trust him and feel certain that he's going to give me the results that I need.
We just found a name for this episode. It's going to be Sex, Chocolate, and Behavioral Finance. So we're gonna get some big downloads when this comes out. So I love that. There's this set of questions that I've spoken about on the podcast before that I'm kind of obsessed with. They're called the 36 questions that lead to love, right? And you've seen this. And the question the researchers had in mind was, is there kind of a pathway to connection? Like, is there a pathway to romance between two people? And effectively all they did with these 36 questions, I pulled them up just now, so give a couple of examples. But like, one question is, what would constitute a perfect day for you? Another question is, for what in life do you feel most grateful? What do you value most in a friendship? But it's not about the weather. It's not about, Oklahoma's second string quarterback or the fact that the whole program's been decimated. I'm very sorry, sir. I'm very sorry.
Yeah. But, we're not going there.
But, it's a little bit more meaningful than that. It's open-ended and it leads to this level of self-disclosure. The other principle that I'll bring in, I went through this Ritz-Carlton training that I found really valuable a few years ago. And, I'm a big fan of the Ritz-Carlton. Who isn't, right? Like when you stay there, it's it's an experience apart. Like it's different than when you stay other places. And they have this two-part emphasis that they call surprise and delight, right? Like that's their goal with every interaction, is to surprise and delight. And I think oftentimes as financial professionals, we're not all that, well, we're not all that surprising or delightful, right? Like the questions we ask are the questions that you have to tick the boxes about. Like, yes, I ask about their income, and I ask about their risk, and I ask about this and that. But people don't leave feeling very understood. And
right.
we've actually done some focus groups at Orion where we've tried different approaches, because we're trying to get this special sauce, right? We're trying to see how well understood do these individuals feel when they leave one of these interactions. And without unveiling any corporate secrets, I can say that the answer is usually not very understood. We have a lot of work to do there. So don't focus on these shallow things to create reverse rapport. Try and create a surprising, delightful engagement model that allows people to talk about themselves and be self-disclosing.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges with this, right, is this all makes sense on the surface. I mean, most people will nod their head and go, yeah, I get that. That makes sense. The problem is that we don't have a great feedback mechanism to know, like, do I ask good questions? Am I asking engaging questions? Right? You kind of think that you are, maybe hope that you are. So one of the best things that I've learned and heard and kind of try asking other people this question is, hey, how can we get better feedback? Is you want to hear feedback from the people that you're with, from the clients that you're with, something along the lines of, no one's ever asked me that question before, or that's a great question, or, I've never thought about that. You want to try to strive to get reactions like that, because that's how you're going to have a different conversation. You're going to surprise and delight, because they're going, you know what, that's important. I can't believe I've never thought about that. And I can't believe no one else has ever asked me that before. Right. It's not perfect. It's not this bulletproof feedback mechanism to say, hey, you're a great question asker. But I think it at least gives you a little signal of whether or not you're you're heading in the right direction.
Yeah. That pause for reflection, or that, like, I've never been asked that question before, breaking that lockstep, show me your taxes, whatever kind of interaction.
Yeah.
I think it's powerful. And I think emotion is another indicator, not that you need to make your clients cry in every interaction or anything like that. But I think the presence of some poignancy and the presence of some emotion, I think is a positive indicator that you're onto something.
Yeah.
So, you have another comment that I want to build on, because I think it's an important point to make. We talk a lot about the uncertainty of financial markets, right? Like all of us market participants get that sort of markets themselves are inherently uncertain, and there's this whole bevy of psychological biases that accompany that uncertainty. What I think is just as true, but less discussed perhaps, and you've talked about this, is that things like people's preferences, goals, likes, dislikes, values, these things change as well. Mm-hmm. So here we are as a profession working with people with shifting priorities, who are invested in these shifting markets. How can we help our clients plan for an uncertain future when not only the markets themselves, but the actual market participants are both subject to change?
So I love this question. I love talking about it, because it's one of the many things, but one of the things that I can't believe the more you think about it, the more you understand it and wrap your mind around it, it becomes hard to believe that it doesn't get more discussion or brainstorming or thoughts or information. It's fascinating that we don't know more about it at this point, because you're right. Like we're in financial advice and financial planning. You have somebody come in and you say, hey, here's where you are and here's where you want to go. So I'm going to put together a plan that ultimately gets you there. And so it's like, hey, you're at point A. Here's point B, and everything's so like future focused. Like here we are today at point A, we want to get you to point B. And we put together the steps and the plans and the investments that can hopefully get you from point A to point B. And we kind of walk away thinking like, oh, great, perfect, straight path. A never moves, B never moves. We'll have the plan to get directly there. And it's like, wait, no, hang on. With what we know is that things change. They don't just change; they change way more than we ever expect them to. So all of a sudden, point B, where you want to go, it's a moving target. It doesn't stay the same. So with that, in mind, you go back, and it's what I call the Amazon principle of financial planning. So if you look at one of Jeff Bezos's most famous quotes, is he says, people always want to know, have you heard this before?
I'm not there yet. I don't recognize it.
I guess I only gave you people want to know. You might need a little bit more. So he said, people love to know, they want to know what's going to change in the next 10 years. What do we need to be preparing for? What are the things that are going to change? And first of all, I would argue that advisors, planners, we don't even get that far in the process. We don't even start thinking about what's going to change. But he says he thinks that's a mistake. What we should be asking, what they should be asking, is not what's going to change, but what's going to stay the same. And once you can pinpoint and identify the things that are going to stay the same, that's what you should pour the most energy and attention and resources into. So for example, he says, instead of focusing on what's going to change, we sit there and we say, okay, well, it's really hard to imagine a world where our consumers want to pay higher prices and they want to wait longer for their deliveries. It's just hard to conceive that. That's probably never going to happen. That sounds ridiculous. So they say, all right, we know people, generally speaking, they'll probably almost always want lower prices. Yeah. And they're going to want as fast a delivery as possible. So he says, focus on the things that you know aren't going to change. So that's the first thing we need to know. That's why it's called the Amazon principle. But the second thing is the end of history illusion, which I'm sure you're probably at least somewhat familiar with, or probably very familiar with. But it was made popular by Dan Gilbert. And essentially, it's the idea that we acknowledge that we've changed a lot in the past and grown a lot in the past, but when we look at ourselves in the future, we tend to see the same person. So ask a 20-year-old who they expect to be when they're 30, and the picture and the image will be pretty much similar to what they see themselves as in the moment. Ask a 30-year-old what they were like when they were 20, and they'll tell you about all the ways that they've grown and changed and evolved in that past 10 years. But even though we know that, it's hard for us to project it out into the future. And so we need to be able to account for the fact that our values, our preferences, our personalities are really no area of our life is truly immune to this. And most of it's going to change more than we think. So from a planning perspective, we know that things are going to change more than we think. The point B is going to evolve and shift and move more than we ever expect. So I think the key and why it's called the Amazon principle is to look at it and say, okay, what are the things that we are least likely to change? And let's try to plan around that. So like goals shift quite a bit, but values tend to persist. Now, there's no bulletproof, there's nothing out there that I know of anyways, that's just guaranteed to never shift and to never change, but try to prioritize planning around the things that are less likely to change. So for example, instead of saying, hey, I want to buy a beach house in 5 years. I mean, you still want to have that goal. That's totally fine. Just know that thing's probably that goal is more likely to change than a value of yours, which might be spending time with family, right? So these values tend to persist. So if you can start making your financial decisions through the lens of values rather than goals, the likelihood of the target doesn't shift as much and your plan doesn't have to change as much. So goals shift, values persist, try to focus more on the things that are less likely to change. And the second thing I would say to that is with this whole dynamic at play is focus more on values and goals, but also create a margin for error, create flexibility in your plan and be willing to go outside of traditional financial advice to accommodate that flexibility. So the best example I have is from my own personal life, right? Like 10 years ago, before I had kids, it was all about, hey, I'm going to work harder than everybody else. Like I'm short, I'm not fast, but like as an athlete, my mentality was always like, hey, I can always outwork the other person. So that carried through for a long time in my life. It was a strength of mine, it worked out well for me. Great. Then we have kids, right? And it's like, all of a sudden I don't really want to be at the office at 7:00 at night anymore, right? Like that's not valuable to me anymore. I want to spend time with my kids. So that led me to think, okay, you know what? I want to start my own business so that I can kind of control my own schedule, right? So that, and that's kind of how the podcast and the business came about. But the reason I say that is I didn't have enough. I had just constantly saved in a 401k, in an IRA, and retirement accounts for that entire period, just because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. I didn't build in any level of flexibility into my own personal finances, right? And so here I am 10 years later, needing some money to kind of get a business up off the ground so that I can spend more time with my family, because I don't really want to be in the office at 7:00 at night as much anymore. But I didn't have that built in because I just did what traditional financial advice said. And it was like, hey, max out your 401k and your retirement accounts, maybe your Roth, and go from there. So I always say, like, try to build in a level of flexibility, put more money in a savings account, or put money in a brokerage account where you can tap into it, but it's not locked up, so that if things do change in your life and you need to make a move because you value different things, you're not locked into your past decisions.
Yeah, there's certain ideas that are so simple but so powerful, and I feel like this distinction between goals and values is absolutely one of them. Goals change all the time. I think about my own financial life. I've had various goalposts, metrics I've wanted to hit, and as soon as you hit one, you're immediately dissatisfied and you're on to the next thing, and the goal shifts. And we know all about the hedonic treadmill and our shifting priorities. And we know that people are poor descriptors of their own wants and their own behaviors. But there are certain things, you gave the example that I would have given, which is family, right? Like, I don't know if 10 years from now, I'm going to want to drive this car or that car. I don't know if my retirement number is going to be this or that. I don't know if I'll want the beach house or not. But I do know that whatever my life looks like then, I'm going to want to have family at the core of it, and that I'm going to want to put them first. And so let's build our plan around this big rock, right? This foundational thing. And then I think from a behavioral perspective, there's rocket fuel in that, right?
Exactly.
Like, we know that salience and like this personal fervor for a mission are the yes that's going to see us through the no of volatile markets and fear and uncertainty and all this thing. Why are we tagging our plan to a beach house, which as much as we may want it, doesn't have real emotional resonance the same way that family or other values do? I love this. I think this is a simple, powerful shift.
Yeah, no, I think so. You're exactly right. We didn't even get to that point. Yeah, we were just talking about like how to account for uncertainty. And I think the values piece is a big portion of that. Equally, right alongside that's exactly what you said. It's if you want to figure out, like, if you want to get somebody to actually move and change their behavior, if you want to ignite behavior change, tap into their values and their why for doing something. So, like, the best advice focuses less on what clients want to achieve, like their goals, and more on why they want to achieve it. And all of a sudden, you'll see this level of follow through and implementation that you don't see when you just simply focus on getting somebody to retirement or buying a vacation home. It just, I mean, like you just alluded to it. But by tapping into their values, you're giving them a more important yes, a more valuable yes, so that they can say no to the things that they may need to say no to that are holding them back. And I stole that from Carl Richards as well. But it's so true and so powerful. Yeah, it has to be mentioned. It's not only is it a great way to plan around uncertainty, right? But it also is a way to ignite and fuel behavior change. And I want to add one more thing, because you said it too about the whole goals idea. Not only do they tend to shift and change, but that also assumes that we accurately identify and select the goals that we want to accomplish in the first place. And that's a whole nother conversation, right? But like, we're just not even good at knowing what our goals are and should be. But assuming that you can actually narrow down and identify the right goals, then all these problems still come into play. So anyways, that's a whole nother conversation, but I think it's still important to mention.
No, it is important to mention, Dan Gilbert, you invoked his name earlier. Dan Gilbert has this, he talks about how good we are at anticipating what sort of physical impact something will have on us. He gives this funny example. He says, nobody ever focus grouped liver and onions ice cream, right? Like, we don't have to think about would liver and onions ice cream be good? Should we, should Ben and Jerry's give this a shot? Like, we can anticipate that that's going to be disgusting. We don't have to investigate it. But then he talks about how poorly we anticipate what's going to make us happy, right? Like, we think, a bigger title, more money, a faster car, 100 different things will make us happy. And humankind is miserable at sort of forecasting what will make them emotionally well off. So why try, right? Like, why try? Let's focus on the things that we know are important to us.
Yeah. And I think to that point, I think that speaks just also to the shifting role of the advisor as far as like helping. Most people don't know what these things are. Most people haven't sat down and taken the time to figure out what is really, really important to me. What are my values? And so it speaks to this shifting role and the importance of having somebody in your life, whether it's an advisor or just a loved one or a therapist, whatever, that's helping guide you to get the clarity that you need. Because generally speaking, most people don't naturally have that and haven't come up with that on their own.
Yeah. So while we're on this topic of things that induce good investor behavior, I want to talk about your friction and fuel framework, which is a lot of F's in a row. So your friction and fuel framework to help bridge the behavior gap. I know advisors are always looking for practical ways to sort of subvert the behavior gap. What have you come up with here?
Yeah, so the idea of the friction and fuel framework is kind of stolen from NASA, because when they I'm not well versed in how to get a rocket into space. It's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, just slightly. There's a little bit. So if you want to know exactly the physics behind it, you can go look it up. But what I do know from the example that I read is that you have to have fuel that shoot the rocket up, but it also requires friction at the same time, or removing and lessening the friction. I'm sorry. You can't just say, hey, we're going to ignite this rocket and it's going to go straight into the air. You have to think about ways to reduce friction. And so from the advisor standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, you want to look at it kind of the same way. Like, what are the ways, if I'm trying to change behavior, what are the ways to do that? Well, you can add more fuel, you can inject fuel, but you also need to look at reducing the friction. So, and we just mentioned one of the best ways to add fuel is through like identifying and clarifying what your values are and the things that are truly most important to you. So we're already on that path. Obviously, that's one of the main ones, right? Another one, if you're looking at fuel, how to get people motivated, how to get them acting and going in the direction that they want to go. Another one would be Morningstar had some research that came out. I know you had Sarah Newcomb on. She was actually part of this research. Morningstar had some research that came out that said that our clients' mental time horizon was more indicative of their savings behavior or influenced their savings behavior more than age, income, and education. And what that essentially boiled down to was how vivid and how descriptive were they about their future selves. And so Hal Hirschfield has some research that we see our future selves as nothing more than a stranger. And so it's kind of like, hey, I'm supposed to be saving for retirement. Great. Yeah, I get that. But like your inclination to save for your retirement's about the same as how much you want to save for the person across the street's retirement. And so the more you can bridge the gap between your current self and your future self, the more vivid and descriptive you can get of your future self, the more likely you are to do the things that you need to do that are hard to do, the more likely you are to increase your savings, to stay invested in a down market. So here's what that generally would sound like. Right? So instead of somebody saying, hey, I want to retire in 10 years, that's good. That's a goal. That's fine. Like that's what somebody wants to do, but that's 10 years off. What you want to try to do is increase or shorten their mental time horizon by getting them to become more vivid. So trying to guide them down the path of what does that look like? So just to kind of cut to the chase, instead of saying, I want to retire in 10 years, I want to retire in 10 years. I want to take some trips with my family. Okay, that's better, but let's keep going. What does that look like? And ultimately you want it to sound something like, I'm going to retire in 10 years. My family, my wife, my kids, my grandkids, we're going to go to Disney World twice a year. We're going to stay at the Swan and Dolphin Hotel. We're going to eat at everybody's favorite restaurant one night. And after dinner, we're going to come home and we're going to have game night with the family before we go to bed. And so you can hear the difference, right? Like, I want to retire and spend time with my family. That's good. But I want to go to Disney World twice a year, stay at the Swan and Dolphin Hotel, eat at these restaurants and have game night when we come back. And you start going, okay, now, when I'm sitting in a new car, deciding, do I want to purchase this new car? And you've got the new car smell. When you have that, that's competing not with this abstract retirement idea, but it's competing with the idea of the clarity that you have, the idea of it's going to take away potentially from spending time at Disney World with my family and eating at the restaurants we love and staying at the hotel we want. So that's another way to add fuel to the fire. Another way to get people to move is to give them more clarity. And then and the list of these is endless, but I'll just give one more that I think is powerful. And in fact, some of the research I found on this came from you, but it's just the power of stories and the way that stories. So fuel a lot of times comes from emotion. And one of the best ways to just basically transplant emotion in somebody and bypass the logical filters of the brain is to tell a story. Mm-hmm. But you don't just want to tell a story. You want to tell a story that's laced with social proof. And because we know from influence research, behavioral research, that one of the mental shortcuts is saying, hey, what do other people do that are like me? I'll use that as a guide. So now you say, hey, I'm going to tell a story that bypasses the logical filters of the brain, that gets somebody motivated, that makes them feel emotional, but I'm also going to tell it with the social proof component. So you basically want to say like something along the lines of, here's what somebody else did in a situation like yours. And I'm kind of being vague for now, right? Instead of getting into it, but like, think about the clients that you're with, think about how you've helped somebody like them, and tell the story of how you've helped the person like them overcome or achieve what they wanted to achieve. And now you're telling a story, you're saying that you've done it for other people. They know that other people do it. And that creates a level of fuel to get them moving in the right direction as well. So that's fuel. Now on the friction side, it's all about removing friction, right? How do we take the barriers away? How do we remove it and make it easier to do? So there's, again, a number of things that we could talk about. There's two things that I would mention primarily that tend to get that are probably the easiest to start doing right away. One is this idea of like, when you give somebody advice of what they need to do, prioritize or focus on making it more reasonable than it is rational. Don't make it optimal, make it doable. So like with my wife, for example, and she's going to kill me for saying this, but I'll use it because it's too good of an example. So hopefully she'll never listen to this, but she signed up for this weight loss program. It's called Noom. Have you heard of Noom?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's psychology based, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But they were like, hey, you want to lose X amount of weight by March. So you say, yeah, here I am today. I want to lose this amount of weight by March. And they tell you exactly what to do it. Well, they said, hey, you need to eat 1,300 calories a day. And it's like, yes, optimally, based on the calculations and the numbers, to lose that amount of weight in that amount of time, you got to eat 1,300 calories a day. But if anybody's ever tried to eat 1,300 calories a day,
that's rough.
Yeah, it's brutal, right? Like it's not going to happen. So, and the same thing applies to our finances. Don't ask somebody to do something that's going to impede on their lifestyle. That's going to, you're basically setting them up for failure. I had a guest on the podcast. It's this quote that just sticks with me. She was like, I would rather give advice that's 90% optimal, that gets implemented half the time, than advice that's 100% optimal, but never gets implemented. And it's kind of like, yeah, it makes sense. But in this industry, we just don't think that way. We think we need to give the 100% optimal spreadsheet advice. So that's one way to remove friction, is make it more reasonable and doable within the confines of somebody's life. The second thing is to what we call chunking your progress, right? So if you're like, when you have a rewards program, right? Like a loyalty rewards program where you go out and once you punch this many holes, right, you get the free coffee. Well, what we know is that if you start somebody a little bit further along, so if you have 2 holes already punched, you're more likely to keep going. And that's because people like the idea of being able to chunk their progress. So the best example I think you can give as far as practical daily use is if you're thinking about somebody's retirement, for example, and it's 30 or 20 years off, right? It's good to get clarity on that. It's good to know exactly what you think you want your retirement to look like, but try to break it up into smaller checkpoints, right? Let's say, hey, here's the goal in a year, right? Here's how much we want to save in a year. Here's how much we want to save every month. Because if you can evaluate in smaller chunks, you start to feel more motivated. You feel more progress because you're evaluating it in a shorter period. And then also when it comes to asking somebody to get their estate planning done, for example, right? Hey, we've gone through this financial plan. You need to do your estate planning. Don't say, hey, you need to get your estate planning done, but break it up into smaller pieces. Say, hey, what is it that you think would be the most valuable thing, the most important thing we should do next to get the estate planning done? And let them tell you, right? Well, I probably should call my attorney. Like, okay, great. Let's do that step next, and then we'll move forward. Don't say, hey, we need to get your will. Well, that's like too far along. Let's break it up into smaller chunks. So it's just a matter of going in and identifying, hey, where am I experiencing the most friction in my process, in my conversations? What part of the process, if I removed it, would make things flow a lot easier? And then go in and apply some of these fuel and friction ideas at that point to help make it go smoother, so people actually do the things they need to do, and they do it more often.
I think we as a human race fall into the trap of focusing so much on fuel, right? That's exactly where our mind goes. We focus on fuel. We leave aside friction. If you look at some of the most effective behavioral inventions ever, like you look at things like Save More Tomorrow, right? Save More Tomorrow, which was this process of auto withdrawing and auto escalating retirement savings. It's the simplest idea in the world. It's led to billions and billions in excess savings for American retirees. And it's all about removing frictions, right? It's all about locking it in, making it easy, making the status quo bias and even laziness work for you instead of against you. So let's be sure to give as much focus to reducing friction as we do to sort of igniting that fuel.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard or phrases I've heard that sticks with me is just whenever you're doing this, design for laziness, create an environment that designs for laziness. And I always think you just gave probably the best example of all time, but a more simplistic one that always sticks with me too is Richard Thaler's talked about this experiment where they were trying to get kids to eat more apples. And so they didn't try to say, hey, here are all the reasons why apples are good for you. They didn't try to give them clarity on, hey, they didn't go the fuel route. They just simply left the bag open. And by leaving the bag open, it gave them easier access to eating more apples, and it increased kids eating apples. And it's kind of like, you're right. That's a good point. We tend to focus so much on, okay, how can we push or fuel in the right direction, but we don't take it into account enough just designing for laziness.
Yeah, I think we sort of assume January 1st levels of motivation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
throughout the year.
Exactly. Yes.
So, yeah. I mean, I talk about behavioral optimal versus spreadsheet optimal.
Yeah,
and I love this idea of better to get 90% optimal at 50% execution.
Yeah,
and then 10% at 100% efficacy. So Brendan, we're out of time, but I have to invite you back for a second episode now because I only got to ask you about half of my questions. This is what happens when two Cardinals fans who are also behavioral finance nerds get together. But start rambling. If people want to know more about your podcast, your work, where can they find you?
Yeah. So the website, the business is called Wired Planning. So you can go to wiredplanning.com. It's got articles and podcasts there. We've got an email that we send out once a month for financial advisors that say, hey, I want to get better at all this stuff, but I don't really know how. And then the podcast is called The Human Side of Money. The best episode of all time is probably episode 8. It features this guy named Daniel Crosby. But yeah, it's good. Yeah, it was pretty solid. Yeah. But it's all about this kind of stuff. Like, hey, the information's out there. The research is out there. The answers are out there. It just tends to fall outside the fields of typical financial advice and financial services. So let's go find the people that are experts at it and help them know how to apply it in our practices and our conversations with clients.
Yes. Well, everyone who's listening to this now knows what a resource you are. I hope you'll go sign up, check out all this stuff, and avail yourself of all the great work he's doing. Thank you so much for coming on to share your wisdom with us, and get ready for round 2 because it's coming quickly.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.